The latest scandal is all about jackets.
There is an issue of the inflated price, there
Yes.
is a question about quality, and there is a really big question of potential corruption and conflict of interest.
No fun time for the Ministry of Defense. And it's not the first time, actually, that the communication by Mr. Reznikov is disastrous. The defense minister was just caught lying, publicly lying. Ukraine is not unprecedentedly corrupt, and it's not incomparably corrupt. That is simply not true. They are sending us to death, all the while stealing public money.
Hi everyone, my name is Anastasiia Lapatina, and you're watching This Week in Ukraine, a video podcast from the Kyiv Independent. Every week, I sit down with one of my newsroom colleagues to dive into Ukraine's most pressing issues. And this time, we're talking about yet another corruption scandal inside Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. I'm joined by the Kyiv Independent investigative reporter Danylo Mokryk. Danylo, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here again.
So, Danylo, the last time we did an episode about corruption on this podcast was basically 3 months ago. It was with our colleague Oleg Sukhov, but it was an entirely different episode because with him, it was about Ukraine's deeply problematic judicial system. With you, however, we want to talk about specifically the Ministry of Defense, basically one of Ukraine's most important institutions right now amid a war, and also, unfortunately, the institution that's been under heavy criticism for corruption again and again. So, what happened this time? What is this latest scandal all about?
The latest scandal is all about jackets that the Ministry of Defense has bought in Turkey. And it turns out that the price of those jackets for the army tripled while the jackets were traveling from Turkey to Ukraine. So the Turkish invoice says that a piece costs $29, and when the jackets arrived in Ukraine, the Ukrainian invoice says that that the price is $86 a piece. Mm-hmm. So that's quite spectacular. It raises questions, and there were also other questions pertaining to the weight, for example, of those jackets, because they only weigh slightly above 1 kilogram, which makes some people think that they are maybe not winter jackets as specified in the documents, but actually summer jackets for the army, or that they are of a very low quality. So there's this question, and finally there's a question that there's a whole big question of conflict of interest, because it turns out that one of the founders of the so-called Turkish enterprise that procured the jackets for Ukraine is actually a nephew of a Ukrainian member of the parliament from the Servant of the People Party, which is who is also a member of the Committee of Defense and National Security. So it raises a lot of questions, and it has given way to a big scandal, actually.
And how did we learn about all of these revelations?
We did, thanks to Ukrainian investigative journalists. So the first journalist to publish those Turkish invoices, and the first journalist to talk about the procurement was Yuri Nikolov. He is already quite famous because of his previous investigations concerning the Ministry of Defense and its procurements. And others joined too. There was the issue about the nephew of the member of parliament. It was a story by Mikhailo Tkach, one of the best-known Ukrainian investigative journalists.
Right. So there is an issue of the inflated price. There
Yes.
is a question about quality. And there is a really big question of potential corruption and conflict of interest. So when all of this comes up, how does the ministry react to all of this? What do they do?
Well, that's that's a scandal in its own right, actually, because at first the defense minister Alexei Reznikov, he just flatly accused Yuri Nikolov of lying, saying that this Turkish invoice was just a fake, which it turned out not to be, because there is a parliamentary inquiry commission, and it's had confirmed that the documents were legit. The next thing Alexei Reznikov did is he suggested a bet to Ukrainian investigative journalists, saying that, well, if it turns out that the Ministry of Defense had actually bought summer jackets instead of winter jackets, he would leave his post. And if not, if it turns out to be a fake, Mikhail Tkach should leave journalism for 3 years, which is obviously a matter of PR for Alexei Reznikov. It's a show communication to him, but it's not funny.
No.
And it's it's just not something you can allow yourself to do when your country is at war, when Ukraine is going through everything that we know it is going through. So it's of a very poor taste, to say the least.
You mentioned that there was an inquiry by a parliamentary commission. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it seems like that it's not only some very well-respected journalists that are accusing the Ministry of Corruption, but it's also not necessarily their own people, but it's also the politicians. It's also the lawmakers that are saying, hey, like, this looks legit. You probably did something wrong here.
Well, there are several commissions like that in the Ukrainian parliament right now. One of them is focusing not only on the Ministry of Defense, but on economic crimes more broadly. And the head of that commission actually confirmed that the Turkish invoice with the price 3 times lower for the jackets was legit. But the sad thing is that the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, had been invited to this commission seating, and he did not come. He sent his deputy minister. It's sad because it would be really interesting to see his face,
right,
when the authenticity of the document is confirmed, and he accused in an interview broadcasted like nationwide the journalist of lying. So the important thing to say is that we do not know for sure that the defense ministry actually paid for winter jackets and got summer jackets. We don't know that for sure. We have some indications of that. So we are asking questions. We are not sure that the actual price of those jackets is 3 times lower. Maybe it's not a matter of inflating the price. Maybe it's a matter of tax evasion, for example. That may be one of the options too, one of the something that explains it. But giving the entire range of the questions raised by this procurement, it's no fun time for the Ministry of Defense. And it's not the first time, actually, that the communication by Mr. Reznikov is disastrous.
And well, we're going to come back to the Ministry of Defense issue, of course. I want to also ask about the party, the Servant of the People party, which is Zelensky's party. It's the ruling party. What's their reaction? I mean, they're also supposedly involved because of their lawmaker and his mysterious nephew. So, what's the reaction there? How do they explain this?
Well, it's a big party, and they have a lot of members in the parliament. So they are often very different. They differ in their opinions and in their behavior too. So there are some that are highly critical of the defense minister, and then there are some that are more critical of Ukrainian investigative journalists. So it's a bit divided. But the issue is very serious because the member of parliament we are talking about, his name is Hennady Kasai, and we are talking about him and his nephew, one of the founders of the Turkish enterprise. He is very connected to a Ukrainian businessman, politician, and a well-known person, Vyacheslav Bohuslayev. He is himself being prosecuted right now for high treason. So he is not someone who has Ukraine's best interest at heart, and that adds, to the problems with this story.
So, as ridiculous as all of this sounds, of course, what's even worse is that this is not even the first time that this kind of corruption scheme related to procurement has happened inside the ministry, right?
Yes, we had something that was called an ag scandal at the end of last year. The issue was, again, the same investigative journalist, Yuri Nikolov. He published some documents stating that the defense ministry actually bought eggs for the army for 17 Ukrainian hryvnias, which is like 40 US cents, something like that. It's maybe a very low price for the United States or the European Union, but it is a high price for, it is a very inflated price for Ukraine. And the thing is that at that time, the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, again, flatly denied the accusations, said that it never happened, that the documents were manipulated, that they were misinterpreted, that there never were any eggs for 17 hryvnias. And finally, as a few months passed, we got official confirmations that actually that was true, that the defense ministry was buying or going to buy eggs for 17 hryvnias. And again, the defense minister was just caught lying, publicly lying. It's not the first time. And that's, remembering this story is why I said that it was not the first time that his communication was disastrous.
So maybe let's explain a bit deeper and kind of in a very obvious way for people why things like this, specifically with procurement in Ukraine, happen and like what's the step-by-step process here. So the way that this happens is that some sort of state governing body and institution sign a contract with somebody who's usually like their person, a company of somebody they know. There's a shady deal being made and they end up spending more money that they could have. And the difference between the actual price for which they could have paid this, they could have bought this fairly, and the price that they end up paying, that difference goes into somebody's pockets, right? Is
Yes.
that how this usually happens? And this is a very popular scheme. Like this isn't a one in a kind situation. Like this happens everywhere, right?
I would say that when we talk about corruption in Ukraine, it is the scheme, the corruption scheme in Ukraine. Generally when we say corruption, we think about bribes and stuff like that, something very mundane. But actually, the government procurements are the main source of corruption in Ukraine. We have had some progress in that domain since 2014, I'd say. It has become progressively more and more transparent. And actually, before the full-scale war started, we got used to all the information about the public procurements being public, so transparent. All the documents should be published. But the full-scale invasion changed that, because now everything, not everything, but a lot of procurements pertaining to the army and to national security issues, etc., are not open to public. You cannot see what is being bought, what is being paid for, and that opens, well, some very big doors for corruption.
This leads perfectly into my next question. Do we have any specific systems in place that filter through state spending like this?
Yes, we do. First of all, we have Prozoro. It's an online platform that actually accumulates. It's the only official platform the government entities and the local entities should use to publish their procurement announcements, so that you can see what are they looking for, how much are they willing to spend, who is sending their proposal, their commercial proposals, etc., so that you can verify it all. And the system itself has been a great source for investigative journalists in Ukraine for years and years now. Another thing that we have is a platform called spending.gov.ua. So it's a platform when you can basically just choose the entity, the state entity or the local entity of your choosing, and look at its spendings. So you can see when it paid, for what it paid, etc. So we have quite a lot of instruments of transparency in Ukraine, which are very useful. The sad part being that mostly only journalists use them. So the general public is not very much interested, into not very much interested in looking into those spendings, procurements, reading the documents, comparing the documents, investigating the participants of those procurements, etc. So the instruments are there, but for them to be really efficient, a much bigger interest from the general public is required.
And I think there is also the question of the efficiency of anti-corruption bodies too, because it's one step is recognizing that there may be corruption, another part is doing something about it.
Yes.
Right. And actually, on that note, is anything happening with Reznikov now? Like, is the government, like the president's office or the ministers or lawmakers, is there some sort of push to investigate this, to punish this, other than like the Facebook feud that Reznikov has with journalists?
I wouldn't say that I see a willingness from a political will to hold Reznikov accountable, if not for some very strange procurements, then at least for his lies, for his public lies. He still keeps occupying his post. So I'm not like optimistic about that. I see no sign. But in general, again, we have had some considerable progress in Ukraine in the anti-corruption domain. During the years leading to the full-scale invasion, for example, we have this high anti-corruption court, which is which has for now a quite a good reputation, and has already convicted more than 100 people, 100 officials in Ukraine of corruption. So, it may sound like baby steps, but they are important baby steps.
What I think a lot when I see some of these scandals come up, especially in the defense sector with the defense ministry, is just the terrible and dangerous effect it may have on our morale of the entire society, but also specifically the morale of soldiers and people who are on the front line. Because
or potential conscripts.
Right.
Too.
Yes. Because, from the conversations I've had with people who are currently fighting, it really doesn't help when you spend your days in a trench and, you think you can die at any moment. And then you read that, kind of like your really high up bosses, like the defense ministry, are doing some shady things like this.
Yeah. So basically, I'm hearing that quite a lot too. The idea being, well, those people, meaning the defense ministry, they are sending us to death, all the while stealing public money. So it doesn't really give you motivation to fight, and it gives a lot of people an excuse, well, not to feel like protecting their country is not their business. It's a perverse logic, but it does exist.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the worst thing actually now with the corruption in Ukraine, because we know logically, and it has been proven historically again and again, that during wars, corruption does not diminish, it grows. It always grows during wars.
Interesting.
But when you're in it, inside the context, you still expect it to be almost extinct, corruption. How can you steal public money? Again, public money, those are taxpayers' money. How can you do that when your country is going through such sufferings and such ordeals? Still, it does happen, and it gives you serious blows to your morale. So yeah, that's the main problem. The main problem here is not about money. It's about how we feel as Ukrainians. There's also a question of propaganda, because, well, there are a lot of people all over the world that are just waiting on any possibility to talk about how Ukraine is absolutely corrupt. And I just want to emphasize that is not so. Ukraine is not unprecedentedly corrupt, and it's not incomparably corrupt. That is simply not true. Corruption exists in every country. And, well, if you look at the last Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, well, you can see that Ukraine is far from being the last country on that rating, and that during the last 10 years, Ukraine has shown some really serious progress. It has gained, if I'm not mistaken, 8 points during the last 10 years. So we are progressing slowly but steadily. And well, if you look, Russian propagandists like to talk about how Ukraine is considerably more corrupt than Russia, which is simply not true.
That's
Again,
ridiculous.
you just open the TI Corruption Perception Index, and you can see that Russia is way below Ukraine.
I mean, the other side of this is, as you already mentioned, the perception and how that affects the situation, because many people worry that if Ukraine doesn't take care of this, at least publicly speaking, it really may impede the flow of Western aid to Ukraine. Do you worry about that?
Well, I do. I do. And to me, again, it's one of the main issues right now about corruption in Ukraine, because Ukraine needs Western help to survive. I think we all understand that. And the more reasons we give, or our government gives, to doubt the viability of that help, the less chances we have of surviving, because we are still right now fighting for survival, no less. And well, if we have corruption scandals like that, and a lack of political will to deal with it, so we can lose. We are losing our chances of survival just naturally, because no Western taxpayer would be happy to hear, well, we are helping Ukraine, but Ukraine is corrupt, but we are still giving your money to Ukraine. No taxpayer would be happy. So the good thing I can say about it is that Ukraine does have quite a vibrant anti-corruption civil society, anti-corruption part of the civil society, and it develops really its anti-corruption infrastructure in terms of institutions. And Ukraine does have quite a lot of excellent investigative journalists focusing on corruption. Again, if we are the fact itself that we are now talking about those scandals in Ukraine, proves that we have freedom of speech, and proves that we have journalists that are competent enough to discover all of that, and courageous enough to talk about that. And they keep doing their jobs. So that gives you something good about Ukraine too.
Zelensky actually suggested something, I'd say, quite radical this week, which is making the crime of corruption at the time of war legally equivalent to treason, state treason. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, first of all, why would he do this? And how was this proposal received?
It was not well received in my bubble, at least, because first of all, the issue with corruption and, corruption crimes and punishment is not the severity of punishments. It's the inevitability of the punishment. So it doesn't matter if it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or if it's life. The issue is whether the punishment is inevitable. It is not today in Ukraine. So what's the difference if you're not punished with 5 years, 10 years, or life? That's not the problem. Legally, this whole idea would allow the transfer of a lot of cases that are currently under the jurisdiction of the National Investigation Bureau, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, transfer them to the Security Service of Ukraine, which is much less trusted.
The SBU?
The SBU, which is much less trusted, which is much less independent, obviously, from the government.
And as far as I know, has been accused of links to the president's office, right?
Oh, accused. President always nominates the head of the SBU, so it's not really, a real problem. The real problem is that it is very much controlled by the president's office.
You can say that, yes.
And the SBU, sadly, does have a history of burying some serious criminal proceedings concerning corruption, taking them from, for example, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and just, burning the case. So we have had cases like that, and that's why we, and by saying we, I mean Ukrainian investigative journalists interested in corruption or anti-corruption, we are not happy with this idea at all, because we would not like to see this transfer of jurisdiction.
So this basically looks like a PR stunt for Zelensky.
Yes,
something to say to the West.
Yes, maybe. I don't know if it's for internal use or external use. But again, the problem is that I can see no upside to it at all, like no efficiency, but I can see some serious downside.
We're now going to be moving to some questions that we got from the members of our community. As always, I'll take this time to remind you guys that it's really easy to support the Kyiv Independent by going to kyivindependent.com/membership. We have our very own membership system. There is an option for a one-time donation and also different tiers of monthly support for as little as $5 a month. And all of our members get really cool perks like access to exclusive events, discussions with editors. There is also a Discord server that we have for all of our members and also the newsroom, and you guys can talk there, shoot us questions. Of course, our favorite perk is the fact that all community members get a chance to send us in questions before every single episode of the podcast, and we try to answer and incorporate as many of them as we can. So one of the questions this week was, who actually tracks the expenditures and conducts audits of all of these procurements that we discussed?
Well, first of all, I have already mentioned the investigative journalists. So the fact that those procurements are meant, at least in theory, to be entirely public gives you the instruments to analyze them and maybe publish investigations about them. Then there are a lot of organs in Ukraine that have for their task to do that. I have already mentioned the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. They monitor those things too, not only them. So there are government institutions tasked with it. There are investigative journalists that are also following it. And again, there's the general public, which, as I have said, for now is not as interested in it as it should be. But there's hope that I think it's the main, actually, the main possible source of progress in Ukraine. That if or when the general public starts to follow those procurements on a regular basis and vastly, that can change the situation with corruption in Ukraine.
So it looks like there isn't like one body or one system or one website that does it. It's many of these different bodies, which is maybe a bit problematic, right? Because it's hard to follow through with everything.
There's no general rule in Ukraine that only this institution or that body is tasked with audits of everyone else. It's quite complex. There are institutions that have, for example, external audits, and some others that don't. There are institutions that have, like observers, and then there are some that do not. So it's complex, it's uneven, and it doesn't add to the transparency, but also it doesn't add to the understanding of the general public of how it actually works. So yeah, there's a lot to improve when it comes to audits in Ukraine.
Another question that we got is quite interesting. The person is asking, do the motives for committing corruption often go beyond economic and into political/ideological?
Well, I have not personally met people that are corrupt by conviction, so that make it like their proud lifestyle of it. But we do have a lot of cultural and ideological roots for corruption in Ukraine, because you have to understand that during decades, Ukraine was ruled by the Kremlin, I mean, during the times of the USSR, and the government itself was viewed as something external, as something that is not here to help you, that is not here for you, that has no connection to you. So the best thing you could do was to avoid it and maybe harm it. So corruption may be viewed a bit romantically as, a form of protest against the government. But and I know some historians and some philosophers who actually say that they state that, well, that's why Ukraine has this cultural leaning to corruption. But personally, I do not like this idea. I do not agree with this idea. It seems more like, playing with thoughts than actually analyzing reality to me.
Well, Danylo, thank you so much. As always, it was very interesting to listen to you.
Thank you.
Also this week, the Pope was heavily criticized for his address to the young Russian Catholics, where he told them to uphold the heritage of their ancestors, heirs of the Great Russia, including Tsars Peter I and Catherine II. Ukraine's government said that Russia is preparing a new wave of mobilization in occupied Crimea, planning to mobilize up to 30,000 people and call up to 10,000 previously conscripted soldiers. And Ukraine liberated the village of Robotyne in Zaporizhia Oblast and began advancing southeast of the village, Ukraine's defense ministry confirmed on August 28th. You can find our show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday morning. If you like this episode, please subscribe to us and like our content wherever you're listening to this podcast. Please also consider supporting the Kyiv Independent so we can keep doing what we do by going to kyivindependent.com/membership and also following us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching.